everyone. I suspect that most of you are in Sullivan County, and I'm speaking to you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where almost 30 years ago, I first met Gilbert Palin. So a little bit about how I got into this project. Back in 1994, I was working as an archaeologist and historian with a consulting company based here in Pittsburgh that had a contract to do the archaeological surveys and historic resource surveys for a highway that was being proposed in Wyoming County, Pennsylvania. One of the parts of the highway included an archaeological site that had been identified previously, the Tonkanic Tannery. So in my role as the archaeologist and the historian for that project, I went out to Tonkanic, which is on the Susquehanna River in northeastern Pennsylvania, and I saw the tannery ruins, and I got my first introduction to Gilbert Palin and his very large, very prolific family of sole leather tanners. So working on this project got me thinking about, would it be a good research project for my PhD dissertation? Because at the same time, I was finishing up my coursework at the University of Pennsylvania in folklore and folk life, where I was focusing on what's called material culture, artifacts, vernacular architecture stuff. And historical archaeology falls under that very large material culture umbrella. So as I got more information about this tannery in Tonkanic and learned more about Gilbert Palin and his brothers, Edward and J.R. Palin, it became clear that the story about the Tonkanic tannery went well beyond the Wyoming County boundary and even well beyond the Pennsylvania state lines. So I decided that, here's a good opportunity to look at the social process of creating an industrial business and all of the things that go into making a business what's called, or at least what I called in my dissertation, a craft dynasty. In business history, it's a family firm. But what led me to Gilbert Palin and his impressive family story is this ruined tannery that's now beneath a highway in Wyoming County, Pennsylvania. Like all of the Palin tanneries, it once was a sprawling, thriving industrial complex dedicated to creating sole leather. And it was a site where bark was processed into tanning liquors and hides were processed into leather. So this research took me from Tonkanic, Pennsylvania to Monroe County, Pennsylvania, Canadensis, and then ultimately across into New York, where I looked at Palin tanneries throughout the Catskills, the Southern Tier, and all the way into Western Pennsylvania in Cattaraugus County. The Palins were by far one of the most prolific and historically significant leather tanning families in American history. And the structure of this talk for the next 35 minutes or so is I'm going to introduce you to the very large and in some cases very confusing Palin family, and you'll see why I say that in a moment. And then I'm going to go through how they organize their industrial business, tanning leather, and then we'll look at the Sullivan County tanneries in particular, the three tanneries that they owned and operated, and then look beyond Sullivan County to the other sites where the Palins launched themselves into after establishing a very strong presence in Sullivan County, where they honed their business and manufacturing skills. So when I say the Palins were a very prolific tanning family, you can get an idea of that dispersion of the family throughout New York and Pennsylvania, just looking at the number of sites associated with the family. The Palins, as best as I can determine, had about 16 tanneries that they owned and operated between the late 18th century and the turn of the 20th century. And as the slide shows, they were distributed first here in the Hudson Valley and the Catskills, and then over into Broome County, into Tonkanic, Wyoming County, Canadensis, which is in Monroe County, and then here's Cattaraugus, limestone in Cattaraugus County. And each of these communities represents a space where the Palens settled initially to found the tannery, to manage it, to produce leather, but they also in the process created towns and created entire cultural systems that became ways of life that you can see evidence of in the cultural landscape today. So before we get into the specifics of what the Palens did, I need to introduce you to the Palin family themselves. And as you can see from this this genealogical slide, it's a hard family to represent in a family tree format. We have at least 4 generations of leather tanners who occupy more than a century and 2 states worth of space in their industrial activities, going all the way back to the late 18th century and Ezekiel Palin's farm in Dutchess County near Poughkeepsie. As far as I can tell, Ezekiel Palin was the first tanner in the Palin family. He served in the American Revolution, came back, opened a small shoe shop and tannery on the family farm, and raised his sons to become tanners themselves. And he's an important figure, not only as the patriarch of this tanning enterprise, tanning family, but also as the inspiration for the sons to go out and spread the industry throughout the region. And when I say Palin family tannery, I'm using the Palins as sort of the foundation for a large extended family that included members of the Flagler family, another familiar Catskills name, and the Northrop family. So you can see in this slide here of Ezekiel Palin's family, Peter Palin, the oldest son, married a Flagler. Catherine Palin married a Flagler. So the pattern was established very early on in this family, where they intermarried with other tanning families and passed the business and tanning skills from one generation to the next, hence the idea that they had this craft dynasty. So Ezekiel Palin, his oldest son, Peter, his next oldest son, Jonathan, then Gilbert E., and John Palin, all became leather tanners. Paul Flagler was a leather tanner as well. And the pattern continued. So we have their children marrying into tanning families or getting into the tanning industry themselves. And you can see in this next generation the start of intermarriage with second cousins, most notably in the Flagler family, and particularly important in the Northrop family. So here we have Jonathan Palin, who had 2 sons, John and George. George became a leather broker in New York City. Gilbert Ezekiel Palin, his children become very important in the Sullivan County story because it was Rufus Palen who moved to Fallsburg, and with him brought his oldest son, born just before the move, Gilbert Ezekiel Palin, and they established the Fallsburg Tannery in 1832. Then James Palin, Rufus's brother, and the other members of that generation. Another significant name that I'll ask you to keep your eye on is George Washington Northrop, whose first wife, Carolyn Palin, was one of Gilbert E. Palin's children. The names are going to start running together very easily here. You'll find a lot of Gilberts, a lot of Jameses, a lot of Edwards, and a lot of Peters. It was a naming convention that was common in Dutch families in the Hudson River Valley, and it's a naming convention that was maintained throughout the Palin family history. Again, we have here the Northrop genealogy, which is very similar to the Palin genealogy in that Northrop's starting very early on around the turn of the 19th century, went into leather tanning and then began marrying into other leather tanning families, notably the Palens. And again, here you see William Northrop and his son, George W. Northrop, and Daniel Northrop, George's uncle, whose sons, Edwin, Lewis, and Mulford, also became tanners, and also in multiple places intermarried with other Palens. George Northrop becomes a very important figure in this story because he not only was a tanner in Sullivan County, but he became a partner with Gilbert E. Palin, Rufus Palen's oldest son, in Canadensis and ultimately in Tonkanic as well. And they were also very closely related because of their marriage to J. Gould's sisters, which we'll get to in a moment. So again, here we have George W. Northrop. Caroline Palin died in 1850 in childbirth, and George's second wife was Sarah Burr Gould, J. Gould's sister. In the Northrop family, two of his children, either by birth or by marriage, also became tanners. So let's take a little look at Ezekiel Palin, the patriarch in this tanning family. Key names and people here are Peter E. Palin, a very important tanner whose sons then spread throughout the region. And you can see here again the intermarriage with Palin women and Flagler men, and the number of adult household occupations which identified themselves as leather tanners. Peter Palin and his children, Jane Palin married a man named Israel Drake. Their census records and tax records indicate that he was a farmer his entire life. And then the remainder of the children here were all tanners. William Palin started out as a tanner and then became a leather and hide broker in New York City. And Gilbert E. Palin, same thing. Most of the adult household members of his children were either tanners or people associated with the industry. And again, Rufus E. Palin, who's most important in the Sullivan County story, Gilbert W. Palin, who also operated a Sullivan County tannery, and then Caroline Palin, who had married George W. Northrop. So by the 1830s, the Palens had become one of the most widespread, most productive tanning families in all of New York State. Gideon Lee, who was an early tanner in the New York swamp area in Manhattan, put together a list of active tanners, and by far the number of tanneries either owned and operated by the Palens or under consideration by the Palens outnumbered all of the other single owner tanners at this early date in 1832. What's curious is Lee put this list together apparently just before Rufus and Jonathan Palin began their construction activities in Fallsburg in Sullivan County. So the Palin family's roots actually begin, as I said, in Dutchess County. There's very little left in the landscape that speaks to the Palin family heritage there. There's a historic Palin Platt house in Poughkeepsie, which is one of the places where Ezekiel Palin lived. And afterwards, after the American Revolution, Ezekiel Palin began tanning on the family farm in the vicinity of the Palin Platt house. The real stars of this story, however, are the three Palin brothers who I first met in Tonkanic: Gilbert E. Palin, Edward F. Palin, and J. Rutson Palin. Gilbert was born in Palenville, New York, just before Rufus moved down to Fallsburg, and then Edward and J. Rutson Palin were both born in Sullivan County. So the Palins broke up the labor responsibilities in the family itself, and one of the ways that they divided the labor. So keep in mind, the family was always entrepreneurial. They never formed a corporation. They always did business by forming partnerships, mostly with other family members. And within those partnerships, the responsibilities for constructing tanneries were parceled out to specific family members. Responsibilities for operating tanneries were parceled out to specific family members, and then other tasks, whether it was managing bark contracts or managing the sales of their leather, were parceled out to particular individuals. Ezekiel Palin was best known in the family for traveling to new tanning sites and building the tanneries. So you see his name in multiple communities throughout the Catskills and southern tier of New York, all the way out to Broome County. And he was married to Ursula Tallman, who is one of the few people we have in the family for whom pictures survive. Peter Palin was another of Ezekiel's sons. He served in the Civil War on the Union side, and then went back to New York and then Pennsylvania, where he ultimately managed for a while the Tonkanic tannery, and then built his own tannery in a neighboring town called Jenningsville. Another important Palin for whom we have surviving photographic evidence is William Palin. William Palin founded a hide and leather brokerage in Manhattan's Swamp District, and he also was a co-owner in the tanneries in Sullivan County and in other communities where the Palins did business. Some other Palin family photos include, again, Peter E. Palin with his wife Rachel and their children. Another photo of Rachel Palin with Ursula Tallman Palin. And then Catherine Utter, another familiar name from Sullivan County. The Palins were in business with Horace Utter at Rockland, which we'll see in a moment. So the women, even though they didn't take an active role in the businesses, played a very important part of maintaining the family's identity and cohesion. In fact, when the Palin family started to fail financially in the 1870s, Ezekiel Palin and Arthur Palin, their wives took ownership of several of the properties. Another important character in the Palin story is Jay Gould, best known for becoming one of the nation's most infamous robber barons for his ownership and control of railroads and industrial enterprises. Jay Gould got his start in Greene County in the 1850s as a land surveyor, and during that outing, he met a tanner, Zadok Pratt, in Prattsville, and got turned on to the idea of tanning as a possible way to make a pretty good living for himself. By 1855, Gould had convinced Pratt to help fund the construction of a new tannery in Monroe County, Pennsylvania, not too far from where George Northrop and Edward and Gilbert Palin were going to found their tannery. Gould's important to the story, not just as a tanner and as a friend and associate of the Palin family, but two of his sisters married into the Palin family. Elizabeth Betty Gould Palin married Gilbert E. Palin in 1860, and Sarah or Sally Burgould Burgould married George Northrop, became his second wife in 1854 after Caroline Palin died in 1850 during childbirth. Today, there isn't much left materially of the Palin family beyond legal records, maps, and the very small number of photographs, mainly the ones that I've shown. To find evidence of the Palins, you have to go to upstate New York cemeteries like the Palin Palenville Cemetery, which carries the Palin name, where the family's patriarchs are buried along with the women in the family. There's Caroline Palin's grave in somewhat disrepair from 1996. She was, again, George Northrop's first wife. Lewis Northrop, you'll notice that it's spelled R-U-P instead of R-O-P. Lewis Northrop and Mulford Northrop moved to Broome County in the 1830s and began establishing tanneries in towns along the Susquehanna River. So let's go back to the Catskills for a moment and think about where the Palens set themselves up. So in 1802, the first industrial Palin tannery was founded. So Zachariah Flagler and Peter Palin founded tannery at what's called the Platkill Clove, and that became their first major industrial operation. They founded their tanneries in places that are very familiar in topography and in landscape. Mountains, fast-running streams. In the early 1800s through the mid 1800s, the forests were on the hillsides were almost all hemlock trees, which provided them with the necessary bark to run their businesses. They needed a lot of fresh water, a lot of fast-moving water, because all of the early Palin tanneries were water-powered. They didn't get into steam power until they jumped across the state line into Pennsylvania in the 1850s. So here's a photo of the Palenville Tannery, the second location where the Palens set up in the 18-teens, and ultimately gave their name to the landscape, Palenville. This is a pretty poor line drawing that has been floating around for several decades. You can actually see the very long typical tannery building here in the lower left foreground. Again, very typical cultural landscapes. This is the Broadhead Creek in Canadensis, a very swift flowing stream. Neversink River near Fallsburg, again, very swift moving opportunity to set up a water-powered industrial operation. And then the Fallsburg Tannery site, which became a paper mill after the Palens failed at this site in 1869. This is a Palin Tannery site in Center Village, which is in Broome County near Binghamton. The only thing left on the landscape at this location is the eponymous Tannery Road at the intersection with the main state highway leading away from Centerville. And then the Tonkanic Tannery, the tannery that introduced me to the Palens. You can see the mountains in the background, the long, sprawling tannery complex in the foreground, and the Susquehanna River down beneath the tree lines. One thing that is fairly consistent with the Palin tanneries is they all conform to a very familiar and similar vocabulary, and we'll see that in some of the fire insurance maps in just a moment. So the Palens were part of a tanning tradition that relied on focusing on building their tanning empire in areas close to hemlock tan bark. They used thousands and thousands and thousands of cords of bark to produce their sole leather. And because of the costs of transporting the raw materials for a tannery, tanners had a choice to make if they wanted to get into the industry. They could locate their tanning facilities close to slaughterhouses and close to the source of hides and pay more to have tan bark brought in, typically from a closer forested region, like they did here in Western Pennsylvania, for example. Or they could build satellite locations or build their sole tannery locations out in the tan bark forests. It was substantially more expensive to transport bark than it was to transport salted hides. So to cut these costs, the tanners like the Palens built tanneries and towns in places like Fallsburg, Neversink, and Rockland there in Sullivan County. To do so, they first bought hundreds, perhaps even thousands of acres of land to supply them with tan bark. The Palens owned more than 1,000 acres during their time in Sullivan County, and they also executed what are called bark contracts to acquire tan bark during the months between May and August to supply the tannery. Tanneries were very hungry places for tan bark. So these bark contracts that they executed, and they're very similar from Sullivan County to Ulster County to Monroe County, Pennsylvania, Wyoming County, Pennsylvania, Broome County, and Cattaraugus County are all fairly similar. They give the Palens the rights to go into these these forested areas to cut down the trees, to peel the bark, and haul the bark back to the tanneries for storage and processing. Another one, this one for Neversink. So this was one of the first bark contracts for Fallsburg after they started depleting the forest lands they had bought. And then one for Neversink, again, similar language. They're given the rights to enter these forested areas and remove the bark. In doing so, the tanners created an incredible economic network in the communities where they worked. So the farmers who owned these forested areas where the tan bark was obtained would have income on an annual basis from the tanners, and the farmers could anticipate, based on the yield of tan bark and the production capacity of tanneries, 20 to 30 years worth of income from these leather tanners doing business in their proximity. These are some slides from upstate New York showing felled hemlock trees and the bark being peeled off. So the bark was peeled on site, put onto sleds or wagons, transported to tanneries, and stored in bark sheds near the tannery buildings, and they were ground. So here's a patent drawing for a bark mill that Gilbert Palin invented and patented in 1871. The tan bark mills were a lot like coffee mills. They grind the bark into a fine dust. The tan bark was then sent to vats or leeches, or was made into tanning liquor because of the high volume of tannic acid in the bark. So these are characteristic of the so-called bark sheds that you would find covering the landscape at tanneries throughout the Catskills, Southern Tier, and into the Poconos and beyond in Pennsylvania. So the bark was removed from the forest, piled in these sheds, and then used inside the tannery throughout the year. And here we have some workers in a Pennsylvania tannery putting the tan bark into the bark mill to be ground for making the tanning liquors. So tanners like the Palens, the Laphams, the Bulkleys, they focused on maximizing their profits by becoming part of the forestry industry, by vertically integrating their enterprises for access to tan bark. Well, think about what was going on in the United States in the 1850s up until the time of the Civil War. So you had tanners like the Palens becoming more professional and more adept at making a profit at making sole leather. At the same time, railroads were replacing canals. So in the 1820s, the Delaware and Hudson Canal came to Sullivan County and made it possible and cheaper for for raw materials to leave the community, or for finished products to leave or come into the community. At the same time that railroads were starting to permeate and replace canals in the 1850s, one of the biggest commodities transported in these new railroads was cattle. And as cattle began to move in great quantities to cities like New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, the number of slaughterhouses increased, and the rise of large-scale stockyards took place. So you have an increased supply of hides. You have an increased demand because of population for finished leather products, whether it's horse furniture like saddles and harnesses, or belting for industrial facilities, or shoes. There's a tremendous demand that's accompanying this tremendous supply of hides and meat. All of this comes together in the tanning industry because the tanners have the capacity, because of their ability to transform these forest products into tanning liquors and ultimately leather, to make the leather in these remote areas. So you see here cattle being offloaded in Communipaw, which is across the Hudson River from New York City. The meat industry was a very important supply chain for leather tanners, who on the other side of the processing, so when you think of a tannery, it processes two things. It processes bark into tanning liquor, and it processes hides into leather. So when the leather is removed from the animals at the slaughterhouses, salted and put on railroad cars or canal barges and sent to the tanneries, it's first cleaned in a beam house, and the hides are then prepared for tanning in the tanning vats. This is what the workers here in this Pennsylvania tannery are doing. After the leather is tanned, it's finished and then shipped off to industrial facilities where the final products are made, whether it's shoes, harnesses, industrial belting, or whatever. The tannery itself is an incredibly sophisticated production facility where bark and hides come together and on the other end become sole leather. I'm using the Tonkanic tanneries Sanborn fire insurance map to illustrate this flow, and it's characteristic not just of the Tonkanic tannery, but all Palin tanneries and their counterparts. So we see here the tan bark comes in and is piled in the bark shed. It's processed in the Leech House, where it's ground up into tanning liquors. So there's your bark shed, the photo, and then its corresponding location in the site. The bark being processed in the Leech House at the bark mills themselves. Hides being processed in the bean house or the hide house. Tanning being done in the vats in the tannery proper itself, and then the finishing being done in the yard or finishing house. So these processes were standard throughout the industry, and this is what would take place on a daily basis at the Palin tanneries in Sullivan County. So the Palens got to Sullivan County in late 1831. They got Fallsburg Tanning by 1832, right there on the Neversink River, and you can actually see the 1855 market fire insurance map showing you a layout very similar to the 1860s, 1870s fire insurance map that I had up on the screen showing the Tonkanic tannery. So the bark sheds, Leech House, tan yard, and finishing house, because it was a water-powered facility, the tannery had its own mill race here, and like their counterparts, the tanners, the Palens specifically here, vertically integrated to make use of the products they were processing. So they ultimately operated sawmills, and they also took advantage of the fall of the river to open a grist mill. And you can see the two mill locations here south of the tannery proper itself. So you can see in this real estate atlas the sawmill and the grist mill tannery building, which by the time this real estate atlas was produced was operating as an ox shoe factory. You can see in this 1870s real estate atlas, Edward Palin still has his home here, and so does Nicholas Flagler. So the Fallsburg Tannery became a very large. Some historians say it's the first true large-scale manufacturing enterprise in Sullivan County, and you can see from this data from several years of censuses that it was a fairly substantial tannery with about $50,000 invested in it 20 years after its founding, employing between 25 and 45 people, producing at its height about 40,000 sides of sole leather. So when a hide went into a tannery, it was a hide. It was split in two to create two sides per hide. That's why when you see numbers like this, there were 20,000 hides that went in, 40,000 sides that went out. Neversink was the second tannery that the Palens founded in Sullivan County. You can see it here in this real estate map identified as the Reynolds Tannery. The Neversink Tannery operated between 1839 and 1871. And again, like the other Palin tanneries, the layout was very similar, with a bark shed sort of at a distance, a leech room or leech house separate from the tannery building proper. This was done to protect the building from fires. The leech house was a very dusty place, prone to fires, and one of the most beloved stories of Rufus Palen in Palenville was a fist fight that he got in early on because he banned smoking in his tanneries. One of his workers refused to follow that rule, and Rufus got into it with him at one point, which made the local courts and local headlines for some time. So the Neversink Tannery was about the same type of facility as Fallsburg, 25 to 45 people employed there, producing about 35 to 40,000 sides of sole leather during its operation. At this location, it was mostly Arthur Palin and William Palin who actually owned the property. They did business like their brethren at Fallsburg, owning large areas of tan bark and executing bark contracts. And then Rockland, the third tannery, which operated between about 1850 and 1884. This was by Palin and Utter, or Utter and Palin, depending on the year of the survey that was being done. So you can see the tannery here, a mill race feeding it, and it was a little smaller operation than the other two Palin tanneries, but it was the longest, last surviving Palin tannery. The first two Palin tanneries tanned out early on. So Fallsburg tanned out in 1869 after exhausting its supply of tan bark, and Neversink was sold in 1871, just before the Palin firm failed entirely. And then the Palins continued tanning at Rockland until Horace Utter retired around 1884. So they during their time in Sullivan County were able to build up a tremendous amount of wealth, a tremendous amount of business skills, which the Palins then took to other communities throughout southern New York and northeastern Pennsylvania. So as I said, one of the communities that they found themselves tanning leather in is Broome County, in this case Center Village, which is on the Susquehanna River near Binghamton. It was a tanning community dominated by Lewis and Mulford Northrop, who began tanning there in the 1830s. And you can see their tannery here. Similar layout. They also had mills in their various tanning enterprises here and in two other communities in Broome County. So you don't see in this 1855 map any Palin names, but with this later real estate map, you can actually see Arthur Palin, who had run the Neversink Tannery, moving his way west after depleting the bark resources in Sullivan County. So you can see Arthur Palin's home lot here, the tannery in its same location there. And then limestone. Farther west in the southern interior of New York, Palins came to this community in the late 1860s, started building up the town, built their tannery. This is Arthur and Gilbert W. Palin. You can see their tannery here, small industrial complex here. And this tannery operated until the Palin Tanning family ended its business in 1873. Again, a lot like its kin in Ulster, Sullivan, and Greene counties, mountainous terrain, fast flowing river with lots of clean water. In 1856, George Northrop and Gilbert Palin, seeing no opportunities in New York because of the family's depletion of the tan bark there, moved to Monroe County, Pennsylvania, and created a tanning town they called Canadensis for the hemlock tree. Its species name is Tsuga canadensis. So the Palins very quickly built a sprawling tannery, a sawmill, company houses, and ultimately some pretty fine homes there. So this is one of the earliest map illustrations of the Canadensis community. This is a later one after the Palins lost the tannery. You can see the tannery here, at this point owned by the Bulkley brothers, and then Edward Palin's home and George Northrop's home. So in addition to giving their name to the landscape and providing a substantial amount of jobs for the people living in these communities, the Palins also contributed to the built environment. So this was the house that Gilbert Palin built first at Canadensis. It became the home where he and George Northrop lived. Again, George, having been married to Sarah Gould for about 6 years, lived there with Gilbert, who was single until 1860 when he married Sarah's sister Betty and built this fine Gothic revival house with a lot of the same stylistic attributes as the earlier house right next door. This became the Pine Knob Inn, a popular bread and breakfast Poconos destination until it burned about 20 years ago. So the Palins did business here from 1856 to 1866 and found it beneficial, based on the demand for leather created by the Civil War, to expand even further. So by the time that Gilbert built this house in 1860, he had already graduated from Yale University, graduated from the Albany College of Medicine with an MD, but he didn't want to practice medicine. He wanted to become a leather tanner to follow in the family business. So at Canadensis, it was Gilbert and George in their tanning town. In 1866, Gilbert and his younger brothers, Edward and Jacob Rutson, moved to Wyoming County on the Susquehanna River. and built a tannery along what at first was the Pennsylvania Canal and later became the Pennsylvania Railroad. But they built a very large industrial tannery in Tonkanic, bark sheds here, a very fine house, worker housing out here. And this very quickly became the leading industry in Tonkanic, Pennsylvania for several decades. It's an early photograph of the Palin Tannery. In this location, like in Canadensis, they were using steam provided by burning spent tan bark, and they were producing much more leather than they had produced in their earlier water-powered facilities. Again, very wealthy. Gilbert Palin contributed to the landscape by building yet another Gothic revival house near his tannery, this one just on top of the hill overlooking the Tonkanic Tannery. They had business relationships with multiple New York firms, including George Palin, William Palin, and the Bulkley brothers and its various iterations, including H.G. Lapham and George Bulkley. This is an envelope from the Tonkanic Tannery shortly before the tannery failed, showing it originated with the Palin brothers going to Lapham and Bulkley. Lapham and Bulkley actually held a substantial amount of Palin family debt in 1873 when the family firm failed. The Palins, as I said, practiced what's called vertical integration. They invested in bark lands, they invested in railroads to get the bark to their tanneries in some cases, or to get their hides to the tanneries and finished leather back out to manufacturers. In 1873, when the Depression hit, they found themselves in a particularly vulnerable position with most of their financial assets residing in the Midland Railroad, and that took a toll on the entire family's tanning assets, and they failed miserably, losing their tanneries at Canadensis, losing tannery at Sullivan County, and losing their Wyoming County tannery at Tonkanic. This is what most of the Palin tanneries look like after several decades of continued use by people who acquired their assets or after abandonment by the Palins. This is the Canadensis Tannery in Monroe County and its ruins, and the ruins of the Fallsburg Tannery. Again, both of these were shot in 1996. So the failure in 1873 took a tremendous toll on the Palins, especially the Palins who found themselves with roots in Sullivan County. The Canadensis Tannery failed, and Gilbert Palin took in George Northrop and George's large family. George went to work at a store in Tonkanic, took charity from Jay Gould, and it was one of cascading number of failures that George experienced over his life. He failed as a leather tanner in Ulster County, failed as a miller and tanner in Sullivan County, and then failed as a tanner in Canadensis in Pennsylvania. The failures caught up with him in 1875 when, while Gilbert and the other residents of Tonkanic were watching a baseball game in August of 1875, George locked himself in a room in Gilbert's sprawling house and committed suicide. Because he was Jay Gould's brother-in-law, the suicide made headlines throughout the eastern United States. Some of the Palins stayed in tanning. So George Northrop's son, Rufus Palen, Northrop went to work for the company that acquired the Tonkanic Tannery, and Peter Palin, who had built a tannery in Jenningsville near Tonkanic, continued to own and manage that tannery until it was sold to the firm that ultimately became the U.S. Leather Company. Gilbert Palin, with his medical degree, decided to go into medicine. He didn't go into medicine to treat people. He went into medicine in Philadelphia in partnership with another doctor who began selling what they called the compound oxygen treatment. This is one of the ads for their compound oxygen treatment, which would not be allowed under food and drug laws in the 21st century. Gilbert Palin, after moving to Philadelphia, bought a very substantial home in the Germantown section, became a lay preacher in Methodism, and ultimately ran for mayor one time in the 1880s on the Prohibition ticket in Philadelphia. Gilbert was a very strict prohibitionist, very devoted to the Methodist faith, and he was one of the founders of Ocean City, New Jersey, which was an early Methodist resort on the Atlantic Ocean. You can see him here listed, identified as Reverend, not Dr. Gilbert E. Palin, and he was the treasurer of the Ocean City Association at that time. The Palin tanneries that didn't close when they failed in 1873 were absorbed by other tanning firms, whether it was Bulkley Brothers, who got the assets in Tonkanic and Canadensis, or others. These were similar tanning families, but not as prolific and not as widespread as the Palins. And over the next 2.5 decades, these tanning firms built up enough wealth and built up enough of an industrial network so that in 1893 they formed the United States Leather Company, which became the wealthiest corporation on paper in the United States, valued between $125,000 and $130,000. It had more money on paper than Standard Oil, and it owned and operated tanneries from New England down to Virginia and west to Illinois and Minnesota. U.S. Leather stayed in business for another 60 odd years. As I said, it was founded by these families who took over many of the Palin tanneries, including Henry G. Lapham, who became the owner of the Tonkanic tannery. So when you think of these bark lands in Pennsylvania, there were a lot of hidden resources beneath these forest lands. One of the most valuable resources was found by Francis Drake in northwestern Pennsylvania: oil. H.G. Lapham, who went on regular tours of his tannery assets in the 1870s and 1880s, kept a diary of his travels. And the diaries are held at Yale University's library. The only passage underlined in H.G. Lapham's diary is the passage where he describes oil being found near the Clarendon Tannery forest lands. It's an important find because H.G. Lapham then goes on to become one of the founders of the Texas Oil Company, or Texaco. And when the U.S. Leather Company finds itself facing increased environmental controls, increased costs to produce leather, decreased costs to produce it overseas, U.S. Leather decides to wind down its business in 1951, and the only surviving subsidiary for the U.S. Leather Company is its gas and oil subsidiary, the Kita Gas and Oil Corporation, founded in the forest lands of northwestern Pennsylvania in the early decades of the 20th century. So besides the business history that the Palins left, the built environment that they left, the landmark houses, the place names, they also left a different legacy that's important to talk about. So if you look at the people who worked in the Palin tanneries, they were all 100%, as far as I can tell, whites, either native-born Americans or immigrants from Germany, Ireland, or England. One of the byproducts of creating all-white tannery towns is these all-white communities in the 20th century became known as Sundown Towns. And the prominent sociologist and historian James Loewen, in his book Sundown Towns, actually called out one of the Palin tannery towns, Canadensis, as an example of a tannery sundown town, an unpleasant byproduct of the way business